Hey, what's up, Speedy's Garage gang? Welcome back to the Speedy's Garage YouTube channel. We're gonna be changing gears a little bit today. You guys have been following along know I've done a lot of work to our Hellcat Go Man Go here. Upgraded supercharger, upgraded fuel system. We've done testing and I think we're ready to go for this season. It's definitely a rockin' and rollin' street car. I don't know, people ask me how much horsepower it makes, and the answer is I really don't know. I only dynoed it the one time back when I first did the pulley swap on the supercharger, and it made about 800 to the tire. Done a lot of work to it since then. Bigger supercharger, quite a bit more boost. I'm gonna guess 900 plus to the tire. We'll find out here soon when the tracks open up how fast it'll go. Remember, the best it's run is a 970 at about 140 miles an hour. Since then, we've switched fuels, gone to E85, and in the heat of summer, it ran a 988 or 983 at 143 miles an hour up in Michigan last August. That was before the new changes. So I'm expecting or hoping for 950s out of it. That's going to be the class I'm going to shoot to run in for this year. So we'll see. But with that done, we're changing gears a little bit. You guys know I've got a 4Runner, call it Project Sport Runner, and hard to believe I've had it like 20 years. And it's coming up on needing some restoration. And it's kind of weird to me to think that I've had a car long enough that it was new, and now I'm having to restore some of the stuff on it. And I'm gonna start with like a maintenance regimen. And I've got a bunch of parts, everything from lower ball joints to hatch struts. These come summer, or warm weather and cold weather, by the way. More on that when we get to that project. New drain bolts, new armrest. I actually went with a real leather one, and some color issues and stuff there. I have to pick out a color. I'll talk more about that. Differential, transfer case, transmission, power steering fluid. I've got everything I need, and I'm going to start today with the suspension work. And this 4Runner is a 2002 model. That makes it a third generation 4Runner, and they're known to be legendary in terms of reliability. And I know of some that have gone 500,000 miles, maybe more than that. But they do have a couple of, I don't know if I'd call it a design flaw or an engineering miss, but definitely a couple of Achilles heels that can actually destroy the vehicle. And with a little bit of maintenance, you can avoid most of that. Anybody that's been around these knows the lower ball joints are the first major issue. If one of these breaks, the suspension actually separates, and I'll put a picture in here of what can happen, but the front wheel will basically peel off, tear up the body, tear up the axle, and they usually, insurance companies total the vehicles now because of their age when that happens. They don't really take into account that they're becoming classics and they're a little bit more desirable. I get offers all the time, people want to buy mine. So we're gonna start with the lower ball joints. I'll show you the part numbers on these. I recommend you go back with factory Toyota parts. That's what I did. For what these cost, I think online discount retail is about $115, $120 per ball joint, so a little expensive, unfortunately. But for how long they last, the ones on mine were originally replaced under a recall that Toyota did about 17 years ago and probably 100,000 miles. So I figure these are about 100,000 mile service life, give or take. There's a way you can test them. I'll show you that in a minute, but it's a little tricky. But here's the part numbers. 43340-39465 and 43330-39585. Obviously you got different for driver and passenger. I am going to need a couple of special tools. These front end service kit, you can go down to your local auto parts store and basically rent this. You buy it, when you get done you return it. I'm hoping one of these pullers will fit over the tie rod end and the lower ball joint and make this job pretty easy. And while I'm at it, I think I'm going to adjust the suspension. It's got the very popular Bilstein 5100 shocks with the Tundra TRD coils. It gave it about a 2-inch lift. The shocks are adjustable. They've got perches, and mine are on the lowest setting. It's been on there about 12 years, I think, 100,000 miles, and I'd like to raise it up one perch. So I'm hoping I can just use these coil spring compressors, compress the spring enough to get the perch to move up, move the little C-locking ring that holds the perch, and put it all back together. But we're going to have to see how that goes. And finally, the rear sway bar end links are shot. They are the factory ones. Years ago, I upgraded to ADCO sway bars, front and rear, to give it better handling. And looking through the toolbox, lo and behold, I found these original front sway bar end links off the truck. The ADCO sway bars came with new front sway bar end links, but not rear sway bar end links. They're still stock, and you'll see with my lift, the sway bar is, tilted up a little bit, and you really want it horizontal to the ground, and the ball joint in the sway bar end link is all shot. Surprisingly, I found these in the toolbox, like I said, and they're just a little bit longer than the factory rear sway bar end link, and I think they'll be a good match for the lift that's on the truck. It's got about a 2-inch lift on it. I'll link to the top of this video a playlist of all the stuff that's been done to that 4Runner so you can catch up if you'd like. But that's the plan, is to put these on at the same time. And no, they weren't this clean. I did take them off the truck when it had, I don't remember how many miles on it, a few. And I sanded them and painted them and cleaned them up. I just can't bring myself to put dirty parts on I shouldn't say a new truck. I can't bring myself to put dirty parts on a truck I'm working on or anything I'm working on, so I usually clean stuff up. So I hit it with a lick of paint, and they look pretty good. So those are my objectives for today. Now I gotta get Go Man Go out of the shop and Project Sport Runner in here. A little bit chilly in here today. Good day to be inside working on the truck, I guess, in the shop. Turn some heat on. And I actually started some of the maintenance restoration last year. I did the timing belt, water pump, all the associated timing belt, idler and drive pulleys. Let's see, what else? The thermostat got replaced. Upper and lower radiator hoses, new radiator, which is also another one of those Achilles heels. You probably want to swap that out about every 10 years. Mine was 20 years old. Radiator was done, a coolant flush and fill, everything was Toyota parts. Found them online at a discount retailer, and I'll link to that video to the top if you're curious. I actually disassembled the radiator to take a look at it. What happens is the transmission fluid flows through the bottom of the radiator in a separate little temperature control module is what I'll call it. It's like a separate radiator inside the radiator, and it's surrounded by coolant, and those lines can crack or have a problem, and you start bleeding transmission fluid into your coolant, which then you start bleeding coolant into your transmission fluid, which ruins the transmission. So something you want to keep an eye on if you have one of these, and these are all getting older now. A telltale sign is when the radiator starts to turn brown. Mine hadn't done that yet, but I did disassemble the radiator. I'll link that to the top. So timing belt, all that stuff has been done. Radiator and cooling system's all up to snuff. Now we're gonna get after that suspension, and I'm gonna start by getting the truck up in the air on jack stands, get the front tires off. You can try to perform an on-vehicle ball joint inspection. There's a couple of ways to do it. What you're looking for is any movement in this area. So you can put a pry bar in here. You can watch this area very closely, and you can apply force. I'm applying quite a bit, and I'm not seeing anything moving, which would lead me to believe that that ball joint is fine. However, notice the grease that is seeping. That's what sort of gives me some concern. I don't know that I 100% trust the on-vehicle inspection, and the field service manual says only 0.5 millimeter of movement. Anything more than that and it's out of spec, and you're supposed to use a dial indicator that would go on here and mount this way, and you could see if there was any movement. I don't have one of those. I've usually just visually inspected them like that at every oil change just to make sure they weren't grossly out of whack. But I'm going to be real curious when I pull this off how loose that actually is. Again, they've got right at 100,000 miles on them, and this 4Runner has about a 2, maybe 2.5 inch lift. Make sure you pay attention to the ball joints because they are side specific. These are marked L and R, so it's pretty hard to mess that up, and it's always from how you're sitting in the vehicle. But the 39585 is your passenger side, and your 39465 is your driver. I think I mentioned they come with new Castle nuts and cotter pins, so you don't have to worry about that. But you will need to buy a couple of cotter pins for the outer tie rod end. And those are the ones I picked up. I picked up 1/8 inch, 2 inch, and I can just trim off if I don't need it that long. And these are stainless. So make sure you check those parts out before you get ready to install. And I did pick up new lower ball joint bolts as well. Here is the part number 90119-10933. You'll need 8 of these. For what they cost, I think they're less than $2 a piece. It was worth it to me to replace them. And Spiker Engineering a couple of years ago actually did a pretty thorough test on these lower ball joint bolts. And the black ones with the washer on them were actually the best. They provided the most clamping force. They used some special equipment to test all this stuff. The previous bolt was a, I forget what you call it, like a cap head bolt, or flange bolt, I think is what it's called. It's got kind of a flange on it, but no washer. And these actually tested way better. And he actually tested loosening them and then tightening them back again. And these lost only 20% of their clamping force on second use. Mine I know have been used once before, so I went ahead and replaced them. It's probably cheap insurance. I've laid out the tools I think I'm going to need to get this done. My light, an assortment of sockets. If you're just doing the ball joints, I think it's mainly a 24 and a 19, and then whatever you need for your sway bar end link perhaps. Mine's a 13 millimeter, some extensions, a hammer, a great big pry bar. That's probably something. I already mentioned the tie rod end tools, or ball joint tools that are going to call these. I borrowed these from the local parts shop. I am going to be using impact guns. I've got this one. I like my battery powered ratchet. It makes things go really quickly. And I think I'll let this guy over here. This is the big boy that I'll use mostly to get all these tight bolts off. I use a lot of DeWalt stuff. Milwaukee has come a long way, and if I were buying stuff today, that might be what I get. But since I already got DeWalt, I'm invested in their batteries. But here's what you're looking at. I did get out a couple of wrenches just in case I need to get into some tight spaces. And you will need torque wrenches. They can go up to at least 105 foot-pounds and down to 37, I think, is the lowest you need for the ball joints. You have to go down to 25 or 18, I'm sorry, 18 if you're gonna mess with the strut. The top strut nut is 18. But I'll go over all that as we go through it. Well, let's get to work. I'm gonna start by getting the cotter pins out of the way for the outer tie rod and the lower ball joint. Pretty straightforward. A little bit of leverage is your friend. There's one. There's two. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the sway bar just in case. I don't know that it's necessary, but I definitely don't want it fighting me. Now I'm going to loosen all of the lower ball joint bolts, but I'm not going to remove them just yet. That's way too tight, I think. And I've even put some penetrating oil on it. Now that I got all the bolts loose, I did wrap the spindle with a rubber bungee cord. I don't expect anything crazy to happen, but I feel better knowing it's secured. If it jars or something, it can't go too far. So with that done, we're going to get the smaller puller on the tie rod end, pop that loose. And when I'm doing something like this, I like to flip the castle nut over and use it sort of as a, not only as a guide for the puller, but also with this nut in place, if when it breaks free, light's flickering, you don't get anything crazy happening. It just drops to the top of the nut and stops. You don't have it flinging everywhere. So that's how I like to do it. And now you have to slide this puller in here, and you want to be careful of the boot. Make sure it's on the lower ball joint and not on the boot, because we're going to need to reuse that. Basically the exact same procedure for lower ball joint bolt. I'll flip that over. And the reason we had to take the tie rod end off so that now we can maneuver this the spindle, give us room for the puller. And this is the bigger one from that kit that I rented or borrowed or whatever you want to call it. We don't have to be as careful with these boots because we're replacing this, but I still like to use good technique. I expect a decent bang out of this one. Oh yeah, that was a good one. All right, to take the tension off that ball joint, I'm going to jack up the lower control arm a little bit. Now I'm going to take out the rest of these 14mm bolts. I'm going to go to a low-powered impact on that one. I didn't want to start it with an impact, so I didn't want to break one of these bolts in there. I feel like it's loose enough now. There's some corrosion on that. I'm glad I replaced these. Now, I can take off the castle nut. And this should be ready to lift out of here. Let's see. Yep, there we go. So I always like to compare old parts to new parts. So here's the original ball joint. You can see it was leaking quite a bit of grease. That's yeah, 100,000 miles on these though. So, and I think one of the updates Toyota made during the recall is these dust boots. I've seen some trucks with them and some trucks without them. Since mine has it, I am going to put it back. So I'm going to take that off first. We'll transfer that over to the new ball joint, but I wanted to really compare them. That one says KR, this one says GR. I'm assuming that's for right side. Big question is, how does the, let's wipe that off. How does the ball joint feel? Let's see. Not gritty. It is not gritty. That's good news. The real test, there's a specification for this, is you thread this nut back on, and then I think you move this back and forth like 5 times, and then you put probably a needle or some kind of torque wrench that can measure resistance, and you turn the ball joint and measure the resistance. And you turn this like 4 times. You know, you'd have your torque wrench connected here, and you'd be turning it like this, kind of monitoring the torque it took to make that spin. And on the 5th turn, you would read the reading. And I think they want something like 22 inch-pounds, something like that. This one feels, surprisingly, with all that grease everywhere, it actually feels pretty tight. I mean, it might have gone a little while longer, but again, for what they cost and for what happens if it breaks, it's cheap insurance. My truck's got a lift on it, so I'm probably going to go to a 100,000 mile interval on these, or 10 years probably. 10 year or 100,000 miles is probably what I'm going to use. I want to compare that to the new ball joint. Let's see if I can get this, put this nut on here. We'll check it and see if it feels any different. I can tell you it's probably, from a stiffness perspective, 25% more stiff. That's about the best I can describe it. And then this, in terms of rotating, that's way tighter. That is way tighter. So the new ball joint is 2 or 3 times the resistance to turn it. So yeah, I feel pretty good about replacing them. I think it was time. I've cleaned up the little dust boot with a little engine degreaser. I don't like putting dirty parts back on the car. And you have to pay attention to how this gets oriented. There's little recesses for the bolt heads. So that's how it goes. So if you have one of these dust boots on yours, make sure you pay attention to that. Now this, as I said, came with a new castle nut and cotter pin. This is ready to go back on the truck. And hopefully you can see that 3 out of my 4 bolts, lower ball joint bolts, they were very corroded. Try to get that close. So highly recommend you replace these if you're doing this job. I can't tighten the lower shock bolt to 101 foot-pounds until I've got some tension on the suspension. So I need to go ahead and reinstall this lower ball joint. Now let's see. Got it prepped with the dust cover. Don't forget that if you had one. I actually like that. And then like so. And it's a little funky because everything wants to move around, but the gist of it is to try to get the 4 bolts to line up with the spindle. I found a combination of wiggling it around and using a pry bar. Looks like that's going to work. Start them all by hand. And with those just snug, I'm going to go ahead and put the castle nut on. Now I can hook up the tie rod end. And when you're working with this lower ball joint, you want to make sure the hole for the cotter pin is facing towards the front of the truck. A little tension on the top with the pry bar. That gets 105 foot-pounds, so 105. And after it clicks, you gotta kind of look to see if the castle nut and the cotter pin hole line up, and I think mine do. If they don't, not a big deal to make a slight adjustment if you have to, just to get it centered. Don't forget to bend it over. And the tie rod end castle nut is 67 foot-pounds. And just like the lower ball joint castle nut, you may have to manipulate it just a tick to get the cotter pin to line up. All right, I moved it just a millimeter. Now we got it. And this is that cotter pin I had to buy, so I'm probably gonna have to trim it. It's a little bit long. And finally, tighten the 14 millimeter. That's what these are, right? Yeah, 14 millimeter lower ball joint bolts. If you have this style, it's 37 foot-pounds. The ones with the washer, black ones with the washer on it. And I'm gonna do it in a cross pattern. That's it. And now, as promised, I'm gonna get after those rear sway bar end links. I did prepare this one. I think I mentioned before I painted it, but I went ahead and also greased the shaft area where the bushings go. Number one, so it doesn't squeak, but number two, that area collects water and gets blasted with debris. So I'm hoping that'll protect it maybe from rusting. And I did put anti-seize on the threads. And my top nut for this is 12 millimeters. Yours may be different. And I find it's easier when working with sway bars, especially if you've got different length end links like I'm about to put on. Just disconnect both sides. That way the sway bar moves free. And my bottom one's a 17 millimeter, and you may need some channel locks because sometimes they'll want to spin. And inspecting it, you can see why I'm putting grease on the new one. Look how rusty that is. Now this has been on here 20 years, but that's in bad shape. The boot on both of them are torn, but surprisingly, you can see in there the ball joint actually looks okay. There is still grease, and it isn't gritty, which is a shocker. But these weren't the right length. I just improvised back when, used what I had. Now that I've got longer ones, I expect the boot and everything will be a little bit happier. Install is just the reverse, and you want to make sure you sandwich the part of the frame with the bushings. And my new one, I think this is a 15 millimeter top nut. Straight. And the torque on the bottom bolt is 51 foot-pounds, if you care to torque it rather than just getting it good and tight. And this one has a flat on it that you can put a wrench like this on if you happen to need it, but mine didn't. And the top bolt on this one is 14 foot-pounds if you care to torque it. Okay, with all that done, all that's left is to get the wheels and tires back on the truck. And don't forget to torque them to 83 foot-pounds using a star pattern. Well, the parts pile got smaller today, and I'm glad I got those ball joints replaced. Looked like those might have gone a little bit longer, but you just never know, and it's cheap insurance. Next will be an alignment, obviously, because I've changed the suspension, so I'll get that done. And then, like I said, new tires are up, so I'm considering going to a, what, 285/75? I think that's the one. These are 265/75s, if I remember right, on a 16-inch wheel. Yeah, 265/75. I was thinking about going to a 285/75, be a little bit taller and a little bit beefier looking tire. Let me know what you guys think. 265/75 or 285/75? I think with a little bit extra height in the front, I can clear a 285 now without not too much worry anyway. But I don't know. I did a lot of work making this car or this truck supercharged and powerful and fast, and it's pretty quick for what it is. I definitely don't want to lose that, so I'm going to have to do a little checking to see what size tire. All in all, ball joints, probably a 3 out of 10 on a difficult scale. They were really easy in my opinion. I only give it a 3 because you have to use those special pullers, that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. Check us out on Instagram. It's @Speedys_garage, as well as the website, www.speedysgarage.net. Stay tuned for more restoration. Got a lot more projects planned on this, and hopefully I'll see you out there.